Welcome everybody. Welcome to the Global Encounters monthly symposium. I'm absolutely delighted tonight. We've got, here we are on the unceded lands of Narrm, also better known as Melbourne. And we obviously acknowledge past and present elders of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people and those of the Kulin Nation. I've been really looking forward to tonight. I first became aware of Dr. Drew Pettifer's work when I was scouring around and looking at various things to do with shipwrecks, particularly those to do with the Dutch. And I came across the wreck of the Zeewijk, his wonderful piece of work. And I was really keen to reach out and to meet him and to hear what he had to say about different ways of telling the story of history. So it's a great pleasure that today he's here to talk about a sorrowful act, the wreck of the Zeewijk. And as usual, the way it'll proceed is Drew will speak for 25-30 minutes. And then we've got Miles Russell Cook, who's curator of Indigenous art, but also co-curator of the new queer program that's coming up at the National Gallery of Victoria. And he'll do a bit of a response to Drew's presentation. And then I'll open it up to questions from the audience and of course from the participants as well. We get to have a bit of a dialogue going. So without any further, I shall stop screen sharing, hand over to Drew and say thank you and welcome.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lynette, for that generous introduction. I'll just share my PowerPoint now. Great. So thanks all for joining this cross-disciplinary discussion around my project, A Sorrowful Act, the Wreck of the Zeewijk. So today we're looking at how creative practice might serve to reframe or represent critical histories, particularly those that might have been excluded from dominant archives or underrepresented within them. I'll speak for about half an hour and then Miles will obviously respond and then we'll open for discussion, which I look forward to engaging with you around. But before I jump in, I also want to recognise that I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations on Wurundjeri country here in Carlton. And pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where you might be joining from and acknowledge all First Nations people who might be present today. I always think when we engage in discussions around art and culture and history and knowledge, it's really critical that we pause to recognise the deep knowledge and continuing culture of First Nations people. So my focus this evening will be on sharing with you a particular project, a case study that came out of a broader investigation within my practice to unearth hidden or obscure LGBTQ+ or queer, as I tend to refer to them mostly through this presentation, histories through creative practice, art practice. My creative practice is interdisciplinary, so I apply different methodologies to different projects, but I've been working fairly consistently in what I refer to as an archival artistic methodology for about a decade now, starting with this body of work back in 2012, 2013, which looked at moments in the struggle for queer equality. And then this one in 2013, which looked at queering a colonial history for the first time. In this case, the story of Charles Sturt, who took whaleboats on his 1844 expedition into the interior of Australia in search of an inland sea that had dried up 100 million years earlier or thereabouts. So from the outset, I want to really propose that creative practice can create unique opportunities for encountering representations of archives and historical events that are embodied, multisensorial and visceral. So for example, for that work, these screens were 4.5 metres wide each, so quite immersive and an embodied experience. And I think this kind of encounter can offer an alternative way of knowing these events. And I know it's not my area of expertise, but I'm aware there have been some interesting developments in museum studies and museology that might resonate with some of these ideas around art and creative practice and encounter. So I'll be interested to see if any of the people in the room with that kind of background might have any reflections when we get to the discussion as well. So I'll come to the details of A Sorrowful Act, the Wreck of the Zeewijk in just a moment. But before I do, I want to reiterate how this particular project and others like it can be thought of as a way of reclaiming hidden social histories in particular, in my case specifically queer histories, that have otherwise been concealed or erased or rendered invisible within archives. And again, there's many historians in the room, so hopefully it's not a controversial statement for me to say that when we learn certain things about the past, that has the potential to destabilise the present and reframe it. And I would argue that queer Australian history exists in a unique kind of context in relation to the potential for reframing. Much of Australia's colonial history was heavily documented, in official records and communications, with a particular focus obviously on managing and maintaining convict behaviour. And so you could argue that our history is particularly highly observed and recorded, with a real focus as well on discipline and control and surveillance. But even within such a heavily regulated and recorded history, queer histories are often deliberately, in fact, obscured or erased. The records that tend to exist are often trials or scandals, like the sodomy trial at the centre of the Zeewijk project. So we have, few records of what would be thought of as positive queer experiences. And even when those documents and records do exist, they're often have been hidden or erased by family members or other people trying to preserve someone's memory or character historically as well. So when it comes to working with, these queer histories, there's a lot of kind of reading between the lines and glancing obtusely at evidence. And so the example here on the screen of the relationship between Captain Moonlight and James Nesbitt is a great example where, identified records have been around for some time now, but it's only in recent years that it's come to inform part of the narrative around this bushranger. So there's a kind of, broader social and political context in which you could situate my research. And so again, the event at the centre of my project only really came to light in the 1990s when the Dutch Australian historian and queer activist Peter de Waal, who was actually one of the 1978ers, one of the original Mardi Gras participants, shared this narrative of this sodomy trial, which has since been identified by several historians, including Graham Willett from Melbourne University, who runs the Australian Queer Archives, or is one of the people running the Australian Queer Archives as well, as one of the earliest recorded moments in queer Australian history as well. The event's almost 300 years old now. It's back in 1727. So the passage of time, coupled with these ideas around invisibility or queer erasure I mentioned before, have really impacted how this history can be recorded and recounted. And again, that's influenced how I've been able to conduct this research and the form that the kind of outputs have taken from the research. And so you can see here one of the journals, the logbooks documenting this history in the Dutch National Archives, and Gun Island, where this event took place. And I'll talk about those a bit in a moment. So to provide some of this historical kind of context, just so we're all on the same page, on the 9th of June in 1727, the Dutch ship the Zeewijk, which looked something like this replica outside the Dutch Maritime Museum of a ship of the same class. So this is outside the Maritime Museum in Amsterdam. The ship struck Half Moon Reef in the Houtman Abrolhos Archipelago, around 65 kilometres off the coast of what's now known as Geraldton in Western Australia. And it ran aground when the lookout, who was up in one of the crow's nests, you can see there, mistook the surf breaking ultimately on Half Moon Reef for reflections of the moon. Almost all of the crew survived when they became lodged basically on this reef, quite intact. And then when conditions allowed, they used the longboats to reach Gun Island, which is about 4 kilometres away. Gun Island is about 800 metres long and 350 metres wide, and there are just over 200 people on the ship that made it to Gun Island. It's mostly limestone. It had no trees and sparse vegetation, and only rose 4 metres above sea level at its highest point. And I'm using the past tense here because in the late 19th century, Gun Island was heavily excavated by guano prospectors. As you can see in this image, it's largely being dug up through history, disturbing a whole range of artefacts in the process as well, making historical interpretation again even more challenging. When they arrived, they set up a series of camps on the right side of this image along the beach. And for months, they lived at this location with their lives centered on finding food and water, maintaining a daily schedule, and building a small boat the Slurpee to get off the island, the first boat built by Europeans in Australian waters, which from this near side, the north side of the island, they set off for and arrived in Batavia in Indonesia now, some 10 months later. But 6 months into their ordeal, at 3 p.m. on the 30th of November, 1727, so very specific, thanks to these records, 2 young men were allegedly found engaging in sodomy. The only records of this incident exist in these official logbooks of the ship, kept by the understeersman Adrian van der Graaf and the captain Jan Steens. And here's the translation of the relevant pages from the journal, which reads, Monday, the 1st of December, 1727. At 8 o'clock, the petty officers came together at our tent and requested to speak to me, who thereupon reported that on yesterday, being the 30th of November, the persons Adrian Spoor from St. Martinsdijk and Peter Engels from Ghent, junior sailors, did not refrain to commit in God-forsaken way the gruesome sin of sodomy with one another. And he goes on to note that the ship's captain then convened the ship's council to hear the matter, like a jury almost, and the 3 petty officers that allegedly witnessed the event made statements, and the 2 junior sailors, again 18-year-old Peter Engels and 22-year-old Adrian Spoor, were questioned. When they refused to admit their so-called crime, they were tortured with fuses burnt between their fingers. They still didn't confess, and Steins then goes on to say that the council conferred and resolved with one another to maroon the evildoers, each on separate islands. So the next day, which was the 2nd of December, 1727, the young men were taken in a longboat with a small cohort of officers, where they were left marooned on 2 separate islands about 6 kilometres away to the north of Gun Island. There's no mention of leaving any provisions or water with them. They were tiny barren islands of less than 100 metres width. So it's pretty clear from the logbooks that this was intended as a form of execution by marooning, which was, of course, a really common punishment for serious offences in the Dutch East India Company. So I set about researching this history, unpacking it as best I could, using what might be considered traditional research processes like reading texts and visiting museums and studying objects and meeting with archaeologists and historians, but also through creative methodologies, with an early focus in particular on photography and video and documenting these histories. My research really began in earnest at the end of 2018 when I spent 2 months doing a residency at the Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts, where I was looking at these sites and objects and speaking with experts like Corrali Suter from Museums Western Australia and Professor Alistair Patterson from UWA, who has spoken in one of these previous seminars, in an attempt to try to reframe and illuminate and contextualise this event that I'd seen recorded in this logbooks that I'd previously accessed online. A few months later, I chartered a boat in Geraldton to take me out to document the sites where the event took place, including Gun Island, which you can see here on the right. You can see the boat down the bottom with Murray, my charter boat captain there, and then Half Moon Reef up to the left. You can see the water breaking there. You can kind of imagine how that might be mistaken for moonlight in night conditions. So I spent a few hours at these sites taking photographs and making video recordings and audio recordings, taking a lot of notes. And I must say that, entering these sites with a focus on a particular historical event, was quite moving. It was a very affective experience. And Amelia Barracan, who is an art historian from the University of Queensland, later contextualised this for me in a conversation as a kind of queer intergenerational exchange, this kind of passage of time of these different queer experiences taking place. Then, towards the end of 2019, I hired a car in Brussels and drove to the tiny village of St. Martinsdijk in the Dutch province of Zeeland in an attempt to literally walk in the footsteps of these young men, in particular Adrian Spoor, who lived and grew up in St. Martinsdijk. And this is almost 300 years after this event, so trying to find these traces in these sites. And On the right here, you can see the local church where Peter de Waal found the baptismal records of Adrian Spoor to connect him to this site and this event. And on the left, you can see the approximate site of the Spoor family home, based on how it's identified in Adrian's grandfather's estate inventory. And there was apparently also a brewery on this site 300 years ago as well. And so I was able to sort of, piece together these histories and walk these streets. I also visited Ghent, which was where Peter Engels lived, which was obviously formerly part of the Netherlands, now part of Belgium, and the port of Vlissingen, which is where the Zeewijk set off from, you can see on the right, and of course the Dutch National Archives in The Hague and the Dutch Maritime Museum in Amsterdam. And I was able to, trace this history in a very material way through objects, sites, and documents. And you can see here on the left, I found it quite amazing that these extremely old records, they prefer you not to wear gloves, I'm assuming, so that you don't accidentally tear pages and the like. But this idea of having a physical encounter with this history was, again, quite a moving experience. And I posted about this on my social media. So you can see here the entry from my Facebook page. How this search for evidence and this engagement with material and the materiality of this event was quite moving. And it seems to me that some of the drivers behind contemporary art practice engaging in materiality, trying to make sense of the world around us and our experiences within it, is also something that's, to a certain degree at least, shared with archivists and historians. And of course, I have a background as a lawyer as well. And so this interest in kind of evidence and justice also permeates my practice, but has a complex relationship to these ideas as well. And I've mentioned how limited historical records impact on what we understand about these histories and how we interpret them, and how we actually come to understand this evidence or what these things might actually be evidence of. Obviously, we have these objects, these sites, but what are they evidence of is a question. And that's where I see art potentially playing a role in relation to manifesting particular forms of speculation through something that can be encountered. And for me, I think this work best embodies that idea for me in this exhibition. So this is an installation of 2 video works side by side. As you can see, they're about 5 minutes duration on a loop, where I found 2 suspected ancestors of the young men who were executed. So using social media, I found 2 young men who lived in the same towns with the same surname, who are actually of a similar age to the young men when they were executed. And I started a discussion with them. I told them about the project, and after examining their own genealogies, they both believe they could potentially be related to these executed men. So there's this kind of potential history. But for me, their ancestry is less important than the fact that they stand in as a human presence. They anchor this history around, real bodies, because this was, an act of violence taken against real bodies. These are real people who had real lives. And so having that anchored, given the event was pre-photography anyway, let alone the fact that they were young men from lower class backgrounds who would certainly not have had any other way of documenting their histories. This idea of these effigies standing here was really critical to stand in for them specifically, but also for young men like them who were, executed legally at the time for the crime of sodomy. And as I said before, marginalised groups and marginalised histories are often particularly erased and suppressed and absent, or treated in kind of disparaging ways within archives. And critical race theorists and queer theorists have acknowledged that contemporary texts need to simultaneously work towards the recuperation of history, and a recognition that historical repression renders full recuperation impossible. So there's this tension between, being able to recuperate and recognising that recuperation is itself not possible in any full, complete sense because of these historical forces. And that opens up a speculative and affective space. And this creates an ongoing challenge of representation that necessitates radical forms of recovery, I would argue, including acknowledging absent archives and histories. So on the left here, you can see Anne Kvetkovic, who acknowledges a desire to archive the affects of queer and feminist histories and archives that were unable to be recorded. And similarly, this idea of alternative histories and archives filling what Michel Foucault refers to as the discontinuities, ruptures and gaps in dominant archives is also another potential strategy. And archival art projects working with marginalised histories also have an interesting kind of relationship to how they represent these histories. They need to obviously carefully avoid replicating processes of oppression. For example, there's a whole history of queer invisibility also being an act of protection, the idea of remaining closeted, for example. While also recognise at the same time this material isn't stagnant, how it's understood changes over time. It's a vehicle that can constantly reflect change in political affinities and historical understandings. And I vividly remember Karali Suter posing this idea of historical representation and what I think she termed quasi-fictions in a cafe in Fremantle during one of our conversations. And I later discovered that the art historian Carrie Lambert-Beatty uses the term parafiction to describe these kinds of artworks that occupy the space between fact and fiction. And this particular work here, I find it really encapsulates some of these ideas around how making alternate or even fictional archives through creative practice can be one way of writing new histories and creating different alliances of representation. And it's a technique applied by many artists, but this project by Zoe Leonard in collaboration with Cyril Dunier called the Faye Richards Photo Archive documents how over 3 years between 93 and 96, they constructed this archive that purported to document the life of a Black American actor called Faye Richards, who was supposedly working in the American film industry in the 1920s and 30s. But each of the 82 photographs they produced for this project was painstakingly staged for the camera. And the archive invites us to track the evolution of her film career and ultimately how it was sabotaged, largely due to racism. And the archive even includes a casting list of the women hired to play Richards, openly acknowledging the artifice of the archive. And so, although Faye Richards never lived, her story is plausible. It stands to address the erasures in histories of race and class and sexuality in cultural histories, and more broadly in histories of cinema. And so, despite the fact that it's a fabrication, there is a truth at the centre of this parafiction that is powerful and real as well, which I would argue applies to my project too. And a sorrowful act, serves as a visualisation of an event that has largely been unspoken, and some elements of it are parafictional, like the video of the two boys. But again, the relationship to truth and evidence is complex. So this monograph, which was produced for the project, for example, contains a range of excellent commissioned essays that arguably constitute the largest and most rigorous account of this historical event to date. So you can see here there's essays by Michael Kirby around queer histories of sodomy in Australia, Dennis Altman around histories of oppression of queer people, Diedrich Wilderman, the curator from the Dutch Maritime Museum, has written an article about how this event ties into the Dutch East India Company history. Karali Suter has written about how objects can be contextualised in museums. And so you can see here this whole unpacking, which for me is really interesting to think about how creative practice can feed back into history and knowledge and archaeology and other epistemologies in ways that potentially add to the dominant historical record as well as to creative practice. And again, I should mention, obviously there are a range of other artists working with this archival art methodology for the last, 2 decades or so. There's been a particular archival impulse, to use the art historian Hal Foster's phrase, around this idea of exploring history and the archive through contemporary practice. And most artists don't intervene in archives in ways that recognise the status of an archive as a kind of static repository. Instead, it's thought of as a powerful tool, a site for the reanimation and reframing and realignment of histories. And so, the archive can, for artists, become a strong site of contestation. It's a space where history and truth and power can be challenged and questioned. And no doubt, Miles will have some interesting insights into this field of practice as well, and how archival art practices can recontextualise social histories. And there's many artists working in this space in Australia, as well as internationally. I'm sure many of you are aware of the work of Brooke Andrew, who's an associate professor in the Department of Fine Art at Monash. In much of his practice, he repurposes colonial archival imagery to reclaim it, to create new and contested meanings from a First Nations perspective. So in this work, Sexy and Dangerous, he pokes fun at stereotypes associated with former colonial subjects. In this recontextualisation of this image of a Jugabay man from North Queensland, taken by Kerry and Co at the start of the 20th century. So, only 100 odd years ago as well, these questions around representation are still playing out. And so, Brooke's work challenges the viewer to rethink the way that history has been constructed, how visual representations function and tell a particular version of history. And again, there's an affinity here with many of the concerns of artists working in the field that runs through this trajectory of practices. I'm going to spend the remainder of my time focusing on a couple of the key works in the exhibition. So this is Untitled Archive, which is a kind of database, a grid installation of the visual archival research that sits behind the project. So there's sites and documents and objects and other material related to the history in this work. So you've got objects from museums Western Australia that I've taken photographs of, photographs from the Stokes collection, so the actual photographs on loan from the Stokes collection, the black and white ones, images of the logbooks, their translations into English, sites on and around Gun Island and Half Moon Reef. And the Stokes collection also loaned 2 Dutch maps of the Abrolhos Islands for the exhibition, again to add this historical context. And I work with Corriley and Patrick at the Shipwrecks Museums Western Australia in Fremantle to design a display of items from the Zeewijk wreck, so these original items as well, which are displayed in these custom-made plinths that I designed to show alongside these maps and other objects in the exhibition. And this image shows how the video work was installed next to an image, an installation consisting of a pile of sand and a pile of shale, representing the makeup of the 2 islands where the boys were believed to have been left. And so you can see this kind of mirroring there as well. This is an image of Sandy Island, where this is believed to be one of the islands in question where the young men were left. And based on discussions with Kevin Edwards, who's a PhD candidate researching the Zeewijk, his PhD is at Flinders, but he's based at the Shipwrecks Museum. I came up with the islands based on his calculations. But again, this is one particular historical perspective. There may be other opinions about which islands they were left on. And these quite large scale photographs, they're 1.5 meters wide, not that you can necessarily get a sense of the scale from the install image. They were also hung together. And so you may have picked up this repeated motif of this idea of, coupling and duality and pairing, which runs through the body of work as well. And there's, other artists who've talked about that in terms of ideas of same-sex attraction too. So Felix Gonzalez Torres, who's one of my favorite artists, has spoken about this idea of pairing and coupling of similar objects or the same objects in a queer context. And perhaps the largest work in the exhibition, and perhaps, in some ways the main work, I would say, is a single channel video, a large projected single channel video, which had its own room in the exhibition. It documents a recreated journey that I undertook from Gun Island, where they were shipwrecked, to Sandy Island, where one of the boys was believed to have been left to die. And this not only recreates the physical journey that the crew would have undertaken to deliver the boys to their fate, but it also replicated the time it would have taken. So the charter boat I hired matched the speed of an 18th century longboat, which I think he believed to be was 6 or 8 knots was the approximate speed. And so over the course of around 38 minutes, we travelled from Gun Island to Sandy Island at that speed. And again, Amelia Barracan has written about the work that, quote, the unedited real-time repetition of that earlier historical duration transferred to the present is offered up as an interval, the duration between one event and the next. And so again, for me, this interval becomes the space between things, the space of transmission of an intergenerational experience, in my case, a queer experience, but also a temporal experience with audiences who sit and encounter this work. And I'll play a short excerpt for you just so you get a sense. This is as the work approaches Sandy Island, but most of the footage is of the ocean, of course, between Gun Island and Sandy Island. So it's a slow, languid, real-time encounter with this history that encourages the audience to, enter a space of reflection around this history. So finally, I want to suggest this project isn't just intended as a reflection on the cruel and unjust past. As queer identities have been increasingly visible and law reforms have been achieved in recent years, responses to gender and sexual diversity have become increasingly polarised, I would argue, and Dennis Altman talks about this in a recent book, Queer Wars, as well. So in Australia, we have ongoing debates about trans rights and religious exemptions to discrimination and the legality of conversion therapy and so on. So, this work is ongoing. The relevance of these queer histories and this pursuit of queer equality and challenges to inequality and injustice persists. And according to the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, the ILGA, as of December 2019, which is the last time they released this map before the exhibition, there were 68 UN member states that still criminalised consensual same-sex sexual acts, and 11 of these states still retain the death penalty as a maximum penalty for that. So, while we can look back at the 17th century and the European laws at the time and see the treatment of queer people, LGBTQ plus people, and queer behaviours or acts as abhorrent, many injustices still persist today. And, as you can see here, that map was replicated in the exhibition. So the image on the left is a work that was in the exhibition itself. So I want to end with a reflection that, an exhibition, like an archive, is a form that requires a temporal commitment to unfold. They need to be encountered and navigated within a duration. An exhibition and an archive both demand time. And so when we accept that history isn't just something that occurs in the past, but it's given a form in the present through that articulation and narration and encounter, we also conceive of the archive as having a future. And so this idea of, recuperatory archival art methodologies, I would argue, can serve to make visible hidden histories, hidden operations of power in ways that can help to illuminate some of these histories, and therefore, in so doing, illuminate the kind of case for social change in the present as well. And I want to suggest that, through these interventions into discourse, these ruptures and slippages that arrive through this kind of practice, artists working in the field are opening up spaces for new histories, new ways of seeing, to take hold through embodied material encounters that offer new ways of seeing and encountering this kind of material. So I might leave it there.
Thank you very much, Drew. There's so much there to think about. I love the idea of different ways of thinking about the past. It's one of the things that drives me as well. I'm going to hand over to Miles, and he'll speak for a few minutes and give us a bit of a response. And then I know I've got some questions, so I'm sure other people will have some too.
Thank you so much, Drew, for that incredible talk. I know I'm not alone in saying that I was quite profoundly moved by your presentation. I hadn't heard the particular story that inspired the exhibition before. Listening to you speak, I couldn't help but think about a tweet that I saw recently. I don't know who originally said it, but it's been kicking around the internet for a while. It said, just remember, if you're homophobic, you have been successfully colonized. And this idea, I suppose, about how Australia and, in Australia, oppression based on sexuality or based on race, for that matter as well, is only as old as European presence. We know that when Europeans came to Australia, they brought with them Christianity. They enforced their own notions of morality, of gender and sexuality onto Aboriginal people. Recently, I was chatting with a friend of mine, Claire Coleman, about how we have no direct evidence about whether queerness did or did not exist in Australia before European arrival. But if we look at, I suppose, the recorded histories in similarly colonized places around the world, it seems incredibly likely that it did exist. So I suppose I had a question for you, Drew, in the first instance, which was that I guess have you given much thought about queerness in Indigenous cultures before European arrival in Australia, and how that kind of connects to this particular project?
Yeah, I have. I think it's a really interesting question and topic, Miles. Thanks for raising it. I am aware, as a white Australian, that isn't my story to tell, but I've been really interested in ways that I might be able to collaborate with First Nations artists on works in that space. But I think it's a really critical question because, as you say, the history isn't necessarily settled, but it's certainly strongly indicated that homophobia, as we understand it, certainly wasn't part of any of the cultures that existed here before colonial settlement. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting area of investigation, something I'd actually like to look at some point in collaboration with First Nations artists.
Well, it's kind of it was a fascinating part of working at museum. I worked at Museum Victoria before I started at the National Gallery, and just kind of spending time in the archive there. And the example I often use is around sacred material, which 99% of it at the museum relates to men. And that's not because women didn't have sacred material, that's because the anthropologists were men and they wrote down what they were looking at, and they were looking at things that looked like them. And so I kind of often think that we have a similar history of erasure as queer people. And in looking at the archive, the onus to prove queerness often falls on us. There's an expectation that everybody in history must have been straight, and we have the responsibility to kind of dig out the queer ones, which actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask you around the archive. Like you, I am also particularly interested in the role of contemporary art in connecting people with stories from the past. And one thing that really fascinates me about your work is the way that you draw on the archive, something that is, I suppose, often thought of as emotionless, but you're really able to kind of explode that myth that the archive is this dry husk that contains just names and dates and impassive facts. And I suppose I want to know a little bit more about your approach to reviving this particular story with all of its emotional dimensions, because certainly from my point of view, I was quite affected when I heard about this. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, I guess, that more personal side to approaching the emotional aspects of the archive.
Yeah, I think that's really, really critical to this whole project. The reason I was so drawn to it was because it is such an affective story. It's so, visceral. I had a bodily response, I think, when I first read about this history. And in terms of narrative as well, it's such the star-crossed lovers type story that it resonates with historical narratives on different levels as well. But yeah, I do think archives sometimes get a bad rap for being these, empirical repositories which just contain facts and documents and histories that are, like you say, dusty items from the past. But again, these are real stories, and I'm sure, again, there's many historians and artists in the room, and so we've all seen how narratives can be incredibly engaging, and so I think my role as an artist working in this space is to get people on the same page and interested in this idea of how these narratives can be encountered and thought of, and yeah, I do think affect and that embodiment and the embodied encounter that artwork requires. There's always the audience's body in relation to whatever artwork they're encountering in an exhibition context, at least, that comes into play that I think makes it really quite real. And it was really interesting to see actually people's responses to the videos of the young men. Actually, like, there was more than one person who encountered that work and started crying, like just visibly, because I deliberately set up the exhibition so that it wasn't the first work you came to. You kind of had a bit of a sense of the narrative before you came to that work. So yeah, it did have that effect. And I think, again, to sometimes make histories real, we need that, that multi-sensorial, multi-layered response to it.
And, you know, putting a living human being to what would otherwise be a kind of entry in a logbook. And that's a way of immediately kind of connecting the past to the present. I think that's really, to me, that's kind of at the heart of a lot of your work, is this idea, I suppose, of reclaiming hidden histories and making them contemporary. As Lynette mentioned when she introduced me, I'm one of 5 curators working on an upcoming show at NGV called Queer, which your work will be displayed in as well. And this exhibition is similarly about excavating queer histories and queer stories from the NGV's collection, which has, in a lot of ways over the years, intentionally erased many artists' queerness. One of the kind of, I suppose, ways that we've organized the show is by broadening out what it means to be a queer story from the collection. So the exhibition is filled with artists who identify as queer, many of who are engaging with the archive, like Brooke and yourself and Gary Lee. And then there are also a number of works by artists who lived in times when such identification was kind of either not possible or not necessary. You know, we often think of also, I guess, the experience of queerness as being this kind of linear trajectory from not acceptance through to acceptance. But of course, throughout time, over the years, there have been many times when queerness was entirely normalized, even in relatively recent memory. And so I guess I'm interested in what you think it means for queer people today, learning about these more forgotten queer stories, and also in particular, learning that the first documented queer European history in Australia was something so profoundly cruel. I'm kind of interested in what you think that actually means, and how that will affect queer people today.
I think it's a really, really good question, because, as I mentioned early on, so much of the history that is recorded around LGBTQ plus queer history comes through trials and scandals and what would generally be seen as negative events from the past. And so this idea of even discovering and contextualizing, positive queer histories, which, as you say, certainly exist at different times in history. There have been very different attitudes to queerness that don't follow a linear trajectory from oppression to acceptance, as you say. And so it becomes a real challenge to think about how we approach these kinds of questions. So one of my next projects in the next couple of years will be around looking at early queer rights organisations, and in the late 60s, early 70s, how they came to frame debate and discussion around equality. So perhaps looking at some of the more positive stories that may come out of that. But really, if you go back further than the 20th century, it becomes increasingly difficult to encounter histories written from perspectives that are able to reveal those positive perspectives. And as you say, part of it is due to the prejudices of the person or people who have undertaken the investigation to begin with. So like you say, gender has played a huge role in the types of objects and artifacts in collections, in the same way heteronormativity has determined how previous generations may have thought about queerness and gender and sexuality more broadly. And so it becomes a really difficult exercise to work through these kind of challenges. So I guess for me, it was about looking at this history, which was, a really poignant and tragic event, and thinking about how that might be framed in a way which can push us more towards reframing where we might be headed rather than where we might have came from, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
I might pop back in now. Thank you so much. That's really fabulous. And I do have a couple of follow-ups myself. Campbell McKnight's just asked a question made a comment really, Drew, very much he obviously enjoys your project and likes the way you're making the history come alive, but asked were you were aware that a man on Tasman's 1641-42 voyage was charged with sodomy, but escaped, and Campbell says, I like to imagine to Indonesia. Lee Penman's asked if that was used shooten. So there might be something for you to follow up, perhaps Lee and Campbell might be able to give you some tips on another case.
Yeah, amazing. There's obviously the really famous case of the sodomy trial, I guess, that was held on a ship where someone was, I always forget his name, Leiden, was left on Ascension Island, basically, in around this similar time, actually, to this event. I think it was 1725, my event 1727, which is interesting too, because it was only 3 years later, 1730, that the Dutch sodomy trials began, almost like the equivalent of a witch hunt of queer people in the Netherlands. So yeah, I wonder whether that might be a fairly early one in the
1641-42. So could be very interesting. Look, I first of all, your talk made me feel very jealous from those times when we used to be able to travel. So I felt very nostalgic about that. I really enjoyed the way you talked about the archive, in a sense, being static, but of course changing over time, because the context of the archive changes over time. And other archival work I've been involved in, we've been permitted the opportunity to, in a sense, write back to the archive. And in particular, I'm thinking I was working with Aboriginal people who were encountering things in the archive, but they were looking at how they might either correct incorrect things or offer alternative interpretations. And I'm wondering if any of the archives you've worked with have shown an interest in the work, potentially having it as another, in a sense, another data point within their data set.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. In my ongoing exchanges with Corriley at Museums WA, there has been discussions around whether my work might sit somewhere in relation to the Museums WA collection, or whether it might be something that might end up in their collection at some point, given it does in many ways function like a museum object, some of the works that document and record. And yeah, this idea of feeding back in and how we tell narratives was something we had lots of exchanges about, but nothing through my practice yet that has necessarily changed how an event has been contextualised. A lot of my work has been with queer archives. The Australian Queer Archive have been an amazing source of reference material for me over the years, where it's been more about putting a spotlight on something that exists in an archive that is underrepresented more so than challenging. But I think it's a really important point.
I was very much dragged to thinking about Greg Denning's work, the kind of performativity of history, which I thought was really key to what you were doing there, sort of putting flesh on the bones, as it were. So that physical engagement with history, I'm very much moved myself by the idea of, getting on a boat and travelling from point A to point B to have that sense and all the rest. So we've got a couple of comments here. There's a little bit going on in the background, which is about Lee and Campbell are talking about this individual case, but I won't go there just right yet. But Leonie has made the observation that along with the physical embodiment already discussed, your exhibition was also site-specific, Perth, Bunbury, Geraldton, another form of embodiment. Are there any plans for it to come to the East Coast? And how might that change the experience? And I think that's a really important question, because presumably it will change the experience.
That's right. I mean, I was only ever able to experience it in Geraldton, which interestingly is the place closest to where the event happened. So that was kind of fortuitous. But we were in lockdown in Melbourne when it was shown in Perth, and then when it went to Bunbury after that, they went into a short lockdown in WA. So I was only able to see it in Geraldton, and the experience there, so close to this history, well, it was particularly moving, and the local community were able to engage in really, specific ways with an existing knowledge of, at the very least, that shipwreck, which interestingly in the Netherlands wasn't the case. There's so many Dutch shipwrecks all over the world that, even the idea, when I was talking to the curator, he had to look up the Zeewijk and when it was, and whereas for us it's so prominent. But yeah, if it came to the East Coast, and it was going to, but COVID has thrown some spanners in the works around timing. So the work has arrived back recently in Victoria. So I have the work back in my studio, and had been looking at a few different gallery options, but galleries in Melbourne are obviously closed at the moment. So there is still potential perhaps for it to be shown, but that context would really shift, because the audiences who don't have that historical.
It's probably something a conversation we should have offline, because it may be an exhibition in conjunction with the Global Encounters project, might be perhaps at a symposium, not in next year, might even be something we could pull off with MARTA, the Monash Gallery. So we might have a chat about that.
Yeah,
Lee has made a really interesting comment here, noting that he was initially alarmed by the idea of parafiction providing some sort of kind of truth, but then thought about counterfactual reasoning in history and legal fictions, such as you might find in a courtroom. Do you have any reflections on these ideas? And maybe they are easier in a creative space than they are in dreary history.
Yeah, well, I think it's really relevant that in the legal context, we often, and in the historical context more broadly actually, we often have to fill in gaps to create a thorough narrative around an event. So, when we're putting together, again, as a lawyer previously, when you're putting together a case, you're trying to put together a narrative which fills in the gaps between the evidence that you have. And so any narrative we tell has some elements of parafiction to it, because we tell the narrative from a particular perspective with an approach to maintaining a form of logic and rationale around that history. And so, in courtrooms, we're often presented, for example, with two different histories and two different legal fictions, depending on which narrative is more persuasive, determines who wins the case. And again, in history, I would argue that a lot of the dominant histories in Australia, for example, are told from particular white settler perspectives, which only recently we're starting to challenge those gaps in narratives with First Nations perspectives, which is where this amazing research project you're engaging in, Lynette, comes in as well, in recognising that the truth that has been told isn't necessarily the whole truth. And it's not to suggest that a parafiction is necessarily, fiction, but it's a parafiction, something different again.
Sure. Rosalie, hi Rosalie, lovely to see you. Has just noted that it was a magnificent, multi-layered, multifaceted presentation, and she was very moved by the story of the marooned men. And I think that affect, I don't think any of us are missing that affect. But she's also asked, is there any archaeological or other evidence that tells more about their final days? And what were some of the items in the images? So some of the items presumably that were on display.
Right. So in relation to the first question, there's an absolutely amazing story that Hugh Edwards recounts in his book, The Wreck of the Half Moon Reef, where in 1844, guano surveyors slept on one of the islands suspected to be where the young men were left, had a terrible night's sleep, and woke up the next morning to find that he'd been sleeping on a skeleton. And so, again, this really vivid image. I immediately thought, and the artists in the room and the contemporary art fans in the room will know of Marina Abramovich's work with lying on a skeleton, which I immediately pictured in relation to that history. So there hasn't been other major evidence discovered that certainly connects it, but there is some, very vivid circumstantial evidence. And some of the items in the images were all kinds of things from the ship, ranging from bottles and vessels through to rosary beads. There was a really beautiful broken rosary bead, which had these two halves creating one whole, which I really thought was a beautiful motif as well, along with things like, buttons and scissors, the kind of everyday items, which in the absence of a personal history may seem mundane, but when kind of connected to an event like this, take on a different poignancy as well.
Guy's asked a question, inspiration from a practicing historian on that front, especially at the intersection of race, class and sexuality in the colonial encounter. He's recommending Natalie Zemon Davis's Fiction in the Archives and, of course, her Return of Martin Guia. So I imagine that you might well be familiar with both of those, but they're certainly some of the things that I was thinking of too, some of the references, and also, as I said earlier, Greg Denning with the performativity of history was really striking me as very relevant there. We don't have a huge amount of time left, so I'm going to ask if there are any questions left from the audience. Please put your hand up. Don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. Doesn't look like we've got any. That was a fantastic session, guys. I really enjoyed that very, very much. I've only really got now to just hand over to the next slide that I have and say this was our second last seminar rather for the year. Our next month is our last seminar for the year, and we're going to have Greg Learman and in discussion with Brian Martin on a Palawa encounter with French Chalou. And please mark in your diaries an important event that is coming up, and that is Monday the 6th to Wednesday the 8th for a couple of hours each day, stretched over the days. One day is in the morning, one is in the afternoon, and one is in the early evening. We are having our first Global Encounters Symposium. Registration will be opening very soon. In fact, I anticipate next week. Day one, Pacific Ocean, with some fantastic people. As you can see there, Keith Camacho, Silla Wai and Matthew Spriggs. Day two, Southeast Asia with Hilma Farid, Sarah Ward and our team. And then day three on the Indian Ocean with Himanshu Prabharay, Sian Lavery and Tiff Shalom. So a really fantastic set of speakers, lineup that I think is going to be wonderful. So really very exciting. So please keep your eyes open for that space. I think that's going to be a really fantastic kind of a showcase of what we've been doing, but also some of our collaborators and some of the people who, frankly, we just admire a great deal and we've invited to come and talk to us because we think what they do is pretty fabulous. So thank you so much. I've got a whole lot of chat here that's saying how wonderful things are. I'm going to save the chat for you guys and I will email it to you, Drew and Miles. I think it's always nice to see what the things. Marina here is saying, thank you for bringing the exhibition to Geraldton. She obviously is based there and enjoyed it very much, moving for our radio audience with their toes in the Indian Ocean. Well, half your luck to have your toes in the Indian Ocean, I'd say, at this point in time. But thank you so much. Wonderful talk. And I really look forward to seeing you all shortly at our symposium and, of course, next month's seminar. So thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.